There are objects in this world that shouldn't exist yet. Machines built centuries before their time. Cities carved from stone too precisely to explain. Writing no living person can read. Tonight, we're not going to solve them. We're just going to sit with them for a while. Turn them over slowly, the way you'd hold a strange stone you found on a beach. Not quite sure what it is, in no hurry to find out. You don't need to remember any of this. You don't need to stay awake for it. Just let your eyes rest, and let the facts drift past like something half-dreamed. Let's begin with a machine that came from the bottom of the sea. The machine that shouldn't exist for another 1,000 years. In the year 1901, off the coast of a small Greek island called Antikythera, a group of sponge divers found something wedged in the wreck of an ancient ship. At first, it looked like nothing, a corroded lump of bronze, fused together by 2,000 years underwater. It sat in a museum drawer in Athens for years, mostly ignored. It wasn't until decades later, when researchers began X-raying the lump, that they understood what they were actually looking at. Inside that unremarkable chunk of bronze were more than 30 precisely cut gears, some smaller than a fingernail, fitted together with a level of mechanical sophistication that simply did not appear again in the historical record for over 1,000 years. This device, now called the Antikythera mechanism, could track the position of the sun and moon. It could predict eclipses. It could even account for the slightly irregular orbit of the moon using a clever pair of gears mounted slightly off-center from one another. A mechanical solution so elegant that some historians simply refused to believe it was real at first. Nothing else like it exists from the ancient world. No simpler versions leading up to it. No later copies. It appears fully formed, brilliant, and then vanishes from history, as if the knowledge to build it was lost the moment its maker died. We call it the world's first analog computer, and somewhere, on a ship that never made it home, its owner probably thought of it as nothing more than a useful little tool for telling the time of year. Let it go, for now. Let your thoughts settle back into the dark, the way that mechanism settled into the sand for 2,000 quiet years. Some mysteries come from the sea, others were built to be seen from the sky, by no one who was ever meant to see them. Let's go somewhere much drier. The stone circle older than farming itself. In the hills of southeastern Turkey, there's a site that broke one of archaeology's oldest assumptions. For a long time, the story of civilization went like this. First, humans learned to farm. Farming let people settle in one place. Settling down eventually allowed for surplus food, and surplus food allowed for the free time. An organization needed to build temples and monuments. Göbekli Tepe broke that story completely. This site, a series of massive carved stone pillars arranged in careful circles, some weighing over 10 tons, was built roughly 11,500 years ago. That's before pottery, before the wheel, before writing, before, as far as we can tell, organized farming existed anywhere on Earth. Which means that hunter-gatherers, small mobile groups who by every assumption we had, should not have had the surplus labor or organization for monumental architecture, came together over generations to quarry, carve, transport, and raise stone pillars taller than a person, decorated with detailed carvings of foxes, snakes, scorpions, and birds. Even stranger, around 8,000 years ago, the people who used this site did something almost no one does to a place they consider sacred. They buried it, deliberately, carefully, filling in the entire complex with soil and rubble as if putting it to sleep. We don't know why. Maybe it was finished. Maybe its purpose had ended. Maybe in some way we can't fully translate across 11,000 years. It was simply time to let it rest. Which feels, in its own way, like a fairly reasonable thing to do for the night. Rest is not the same as disappearing. Not every mystery is made of stone. Some are small enough to hold in one hand and just as hard to explain. The clay jar that may have held electricity. In 1936, near Baghdad, workers digging for a railway uncovered a small clay pot. Inside, it was a copper cylinder, and inside that cylinder, an iron rod held in place with asphalt. Unremarkable at a glance, a container, except that when researchers examined the arrangement more closely, they realized it looked very closely like a battery. Fill it with an acidic liquid, like vinegar or grape juice, and the copper and iron combination inside would, in theory, generate a small electric current. Not much, maybe half a volt, enough to feel a slight tingle, or perhaps enough for a very specific, very old purpose we haven't fully guessed. Nobody knows with certainty what it was for. Some researchers think it's simply a container for storing sacred scrolls. The metal and asphalt arrangement, coincidental. Others have pointed out that ancient goldsmiths may have used a small current like this for electroplating, coating a cheaper metal object in a thin layer of gold or silver to make it shine like something more precious. We may never know which explanation is true. What we do know is that nearly 2,000 years before anyone else was formally credited with harnessing electricity, someone in ancient Mesopotamia built an object that, if you gave it the right liquid, would quietly hum with a little bit of borrowed lightning. And then set it down and walked away, the way you might set down a thought right before sleep, unfinished but not forgotten. From something you could hold in your palm to something so large it can only be understood from the sky. The drawings meant to be seen by no one on the ground. In the high desert of southern Peru, there's a plain of dry, reddish earth where wind almost never blows and rain almost never falls. Sometime between 500 BCE and 500 CE, the people who lived there began removing the top layer of reddish rock across the plain, exposing the pale ground beneath, and in doing so, drew, not small drawings, enormous ones, a hummingbird nearly 300 feet long, a monkey with a spiraled tail, a spider, long perfectly straight lines stretching for miles across the desert floor. The strange part isn't that they made these drawings, it's that from the ground, standing among the lines, you can't actually see what they form. You're too close. The shapes only resolve into recognizable animals from high above, from an altitude that, as far as we know, no one in that era had any confirmed way of reaching. So who were they for? Some researchers believe the lines were walked as ritual paths, meant to be experienced with the feet and the body, not the eyes, a kind of prayer written into the earth itself, felt rather than seen. Others believe they were tied to water, pointing toward underground springs in a landscape that received almost no rainfall of its own. A few have wondered, more provocatively, whether the builders had access to some form of elevated viewpoint we haven't identified, a hot air balloon, a tall structure, a nearby hill with a now eroded vantage point. And the desert has kept the answer to itself for 1,500 years. The way this dry, windless plain has kept the lines themselves nearly perfectly preserved, untouched by rain, waiting quietly for someone above to look down. You don't have to solve it. Just picture it. A hummingbird, drawn in dust, visible only to the sky. Some mysteries are drawn on the earth. Others are written in a language that has never once been read. The book nobody has ever been able to read. Somewhere in a rare book library at Yale University sits a manuscript of about 240 pages, covered edge to edge in flowing, confident handwriting, and illustrated with plants that don't exist, star charts that match no known sky, and small figures bathing in strange, interconnected pools of green liquid. Nobody can read a single word of it. Not because the handwriting is messy, it isn't. It's remarkably fluid and consistent. The kind of handwriting that comes from someone who wrote quickly and naturally, the way you or I might write a grocery list. It simply isn't in any language, alphabet or code that has ever been identified. Not Latin, not any known cipher, not any dead language recovered from any other source. The manuscript is named after Wilfrid Voynich, the book dealer who brought it to public attention in 1912, though radiocarbon dating of the vellum places its actual creation in the early 1400s, genuinely old, not a later forgery, as some once suspected. Codebreakers who cracked German military ciphers during the Second World War have tried and failed. Modern computer analysis has found the text does follow statistical patterns consistent with real language, word lengths, repetition patterns, the kind of internal logic that random gibberish typically lacks. Whatever this is, it was very likely meant to say something. We just don't know what. An early attempt at a constructed language, an elaborate medical or herbal text in a private code, a hoax so dedicated its creator wrote 240 pages of consistent fake language purely for the sake of it. "600 years of silence in a language built for an audience of one that arrived and left this world without ever telling us who that was." From words no one can read, to a cave carved with a precision that seems to need no explanation at all, until you ask who could have carved it and why. The underground city with no historical record. In 1992, a man in China's Zhejiang province was pumping water from a pond near his village. A pond the locals had always called bottomless and avoided. When the water finally drained, he found a cave. Not a natural one. A vast, deliberately carved chamber with smooth chisel marks running in perfectly parallel lines across every wall, floor, and ceiling. The kind of tool marks that suggest careful, coordinated, skilled labor, not a hurried excavation. As more of the surrounding hills were drained and explored, at least 24 more caverns were discovered nearby, some large enough to hold several thousand people, supported by carefully carved pillars left in place to bear the ceiling's weight, a level of structural planning that implies real engineering knowledge, not simple digging. And here's the part that unsettles most historians. There is no written record of them. Not in local chronicles, not in regional histories, not in the oral memory of nearby villages, beyond the vague sense that the pond was somewhere you didn't go. An excavation project on this scale, moving what's estimated to be enough rock to fill a small mountain, should have left some trace in the historical record. It didn't. Dating estimates place the caves at roughly 2,000 years old, though even that is uncertain. We don't know who built them, how many people it took, how long it took, or, strangest of all, why an achievement this massive was never written down, never remembered, and eventually simply flooded over and forgotten by the very descendants of the people who dug it. Some things, it seems, are built to be finished, not to be remembered. We're a little past the middle now. If you're still awake, that's all right. There's no rush tonight, and nowhere else you need to be. Let's go somewhere high in the mountains. The wall where a blade cannot fit between the stones. High above the city of Cusco, in the mountains of Peru, there's a fortress wall built by the Inca called Sacsayhuamán. Its stones are enormous, some estimated to weigh well over 100 tons. roughly the weight of a fully loaded freight train car, and they were quarried from sites miles away, then transported up steep mountain terrain, without wheels, without iron tools, and without draft animals strong enough for the job. But the true mystery isn't the size, it's the fit. Each massive stone is cut in an irregular, almost puzzle-like shape and set against its neighbors with a precision so exact that in many places you genuinely cannot slide a piece of paper into the seam between them. No mortar holds these walls together, just the sheer, patient accuracy of the cut. Modern engineers who have studied the site still debate exactly how it was done. Some believe the Inca used a technique of repeatedly test-fitting each stone, grinding down the high points with harder stones and sand abrasives over what may have been years for a single wall. Others point to Inca skill with thermal expansion, heating and rapidly cooling stone to help fracture it into more workable shapes. Either way, the patience required is almost hard to picture. Generations of laborers grinding stone against stone for a fit so perfect it has survived some of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded in the region. Walls that flex and resettle rather than crack, while more modern structures built centuries later right beside them crumbled. Perfect, unhurried patience, built to outlast the ground itself, shaking beneath it. From stone fitted by hand to a substance the Romans mixed by the ton, one that grows stronger with age in a way we're only now beginning to understand. The concrete that gets stronger, underwater, 2,000 years later, along the coastlines of the old Roman Empire, there are structures, piers, breakwaters, harbor walls that have sat in salt water for roughly 2,000 years and are, in places, still holding. Modern marine concrete, by comparison, often begins to crack and crumble within a few decades of constant seawater exposure. Roman concrete seems to do something closer to the opposite. Studies of these ancient harbor structures have found the material actually gaining strength over centuries in seawater rather than slowly breaking down. For a long time, this seemed almost impossible to explain. Then, researchers began examining the material at a mineral level and found something unusual. Tiny, bright white mineral deposits scattered through the concrete, long dismissed by earlier scholars as flaws or signs of sloppy mixing. They weren't flaws, they were the key. Those deposits are made of a reactive lime compound that, when the concrete develops a small crack, as all concrete eventually does, comes into contact with water flowing through that crack and reacts to form new mineral crystals that grow directly into the gap, sealing it from within. The material, in a very real sense, was designed to heal itself. The Romans achieved this, as far as we can tell, using a specific volcanic ash from the region around Pozzuoli, mixed with lime in a process whose exact proportions and methods were never formally written down in a way that survived. Practical knowledge passed from builder to builder, then eventually lost as the empire that used it fell. We're only now, with electron microscopes and centuries of hindsight, relearning what a Roman engineer simply knew: how to build something meant to heal itself long after he was gone. There's something quietly comforting in that. Some things are made strong enough to mend their own small cracks, given enough time and enough water passing gently through them. From something built to heal itself in the water, to faces built to watch the horizon forever. The giants who were never meant to stay still. On a remote, windswept island in the Pacific, one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth, nearly 1,000 enormous stone figures stand facing inland, watching over the land rather than the sea. These are the Moai of Rapa Nui, most carved between the years 1250 and 1500, some standing over 30 feet tall and weighing upwards of 80 tons. For a long time, the dominant question was simply, how did a small island population move statues this massive across miles of uneven terrain, without wheels, without large draft animals, without modern machinery? The answer, when researchers finally tested it, turned out to be almost playful. Working with the islanders' own oral traditions, which had always insisted the statues walked to their positions, archaeologists attached ropes to a full-scale Moai replica and discovered that, with the statue's base carved into a subtle forward curve, a coordinated team could rock it side to side, walking it forward in a slow, swaying rhythm, the way you might walk a heavy refrigerator across a kitchen floor by rocking it corner to corner. The legends had been telling the truth the entire time. The giants really did walk. But a deeper mystery remains in why the statues stopped. Sometime in the 1600s, Moai construction and transport simply halted, and many existing statues were deliberately toppled, not by outside invaders, but, evidence suggests, by the islanders themselves, possibly amid resource scarcity, internal conflict, or a broader collapse in the social and spiritual systems that had once made building giants a shared purpose. Faces built to watch forever, laid down by the very hands that once made them walk. Even giants, it turns out, are eventually allowed to rest. From figures who once walked, to a language carved into thousands of small stone seals, one we've never learned to sound out. The civilization that left us a puzzle with no key, more than 4,000 years ago, along the banks of what's now the border between India and Pakistan, one of the largest and most advanced civilizations of the ancient world, quietly thrived. The Indus Valley Civilization built cities with remarkably advanced urban planning, grid-patterned streets, standardized brick sizes used across enormous distances, and some of the earliest known covered drainage and sewage systems anywhere in the world, centuries ahead of comparable systems elsewhere. and they left behind thousands of small stone seals stamped with short sequences of symbols, a script clearly used for trade, record-keeping, or perhaps something more. We have never read a single one. Unlike other ancient scripts, we have no Rosetta Stone for the Indus script, no bilingual inscription pairing it with a language we already understand. The average inscription is also extremely short, often just 4 or 5 symbols, which makes standard code-breaking techniques far less effective than they'd be on longer texts. Some researchers aren't even certain it represents spoken language at all. It might be a system of religious or clan symbols rather than a true written script. What we do know is that this was a civilization advanced enough to plan cities with a precision some modern towns would envy, sophisticated enough to standardize weights and measures across a trade network spanning hundreds of miles, and yet the words they used to describe their own lives to one another remain, for now, permanently out of reach. An entire civilization speaking to us in symbols we can see perfectly clearly and still cannot hear. One more mystery before we pause. A map that seems to know more than the person who drew it possibly could have. The map drawn before anyone had seen what it shows. In 1929, inside the old imperial palace in Istanbul, historians found a fragment of a map drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. The map itself was compiled by its own author's notes from a patchwork of older source maps, some reportedly dating back centuries, including charts said to descend from the era of Alexander the Great, most of which no longer survive for us to check. What makes it strange is a stretch of coastline drawn along the map's southern edge. A landmass some researchers believe corresponds, in rough outline, to the coast of Antarctica, centuries before that continent was formally discovered by Western explorers in 1820, and long before it would have been visible beneath the ice sheet that covers it today. This claim is genuinely disputed. Many cartographic historians believe the southern coastline is simply a stretch of South America, curved and distorted by the limitations of the projection Piri Reis was using to fit a round world onto a flat page, an ordinary map-making error, not a lost memory of ice-free Antarctica. But the debate itself is part of what keeps this map alive in our imagination. A single sheet of gazelle skin parchment, drawn from older maps that no longer exist, describing coastlines with a confidence that has outlasted 5 centuries of argument over what exactly its maker actually knew, and where that knowledge first came from. A map is just a memory, drawn small enough to carry. Sometimes we lose the person who remembered first, and keep only the memory itself, waiting quietly to be understood. The library that held almost everything. We'll pause for a moment somewhere that isn't a riddle so much as a quiet, enormous loss. In the ancient city of Alexandria, in Egypt, there once stood a library meant to contain a copy of every piece of writing in the known world: histories, plays, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, poetry, gathered from every ship that passed through the harbor, copied by hand and shelved. At its height, it may have held several 100,000 scrolls, a single building, holding what was, for its era, close to the total of recorded human knowledge in one place. And we don't actually know with certainty how it was lost. Not one dramatic fire, as the popular story often goes, but very likely a long, slow decline across centuries, a partial fire during Julius Caesar's military campaign in the city, further damage and neglect under later rulers, a gradual reduction in funding and scholarly attention, until a great institution didn't so much burn down all at once, as quietly stopped being maintained and slowly, gently came apart. Almost everything it once held is gone. Entire plays we know existed only by title. Mathematical and astronomical works referenced by later scholars who had access to originals we no longer have. Voices, once fully preserved in one place, now reduced to fragments, echoes, second-hand summaries written by people who were lucky enough to read the originals before they slipped away. It's a strange, gentle kind of grief, if you let yourself feel it. Not a tragedy of fire and drama, but of ordinary, quiet forgetting. The same soft erosion that takes most things, eventually, if no one keeps tending to them. We're only halfway through tonight's stories. Let your shoulders drop a little, let your breathing slow, and let's keep drifting through a few more. The temple ceiling that looks like it's glowing. In the Egyptian temple complex of Dendera, deep in a small underground crypt, there's a carved relief that has caused more argument among fringe theorists and cautious historians alike than almost any other image in Egyptology. It shows a large, elongated bulb-like shape connected by what looks like a curling cable to a box with a serpent coiled inside the bulb, where a filament might sit in a modern light bulb. Some have looked at this carving and seen exactly that. A light bulb thousands of years before Edison. Evidence of lost ancient technology. Egyptologists who study the temple's full context read it very differently. The relief sits among other traditional Egyptian religious imagery and closely matches a known mythological scene, a lotus flower giving rise to a serpent, representing an act of divine creation, a visual metaphor common in Egyptian temple art of the period, not a diagram of an object. What makes the debate linger, though, is simply how strange the image looks out of context, how naturally the eye wants to see a familiar shape in an unfamiliar carving, reaching across a few thousand years for something that feels recognizable in the dark. Maybe that's the real mystery. Not the object itself, but how easily any of us, staring at something old enough, start to see our own world reflected. The stones that traveled farther than anyone expected. At Stonehenge, on a wide, quiet plain in southern England, the enormous outer sarsen stones came from relatively nearby, roughly 20 miles away. But a smaller set of stones inside the circle, the bluestones, each weighing 2 to 5 tons, came from something far stranger. Geological analysis traced their origin to a specific set of outcrops in the Preseli Hills in Wales, roughly 180 miles from the site. For a monument built without wheels or metal tools, moving multi-ton stones that distance across land and possibly by water represents an extraordinary commitment of labor, coordination, and time for a purpose we still can't fully name. Recent research has added another layer. Some of these Welsh outcrops appear to have already been the site of a smaller stone circle, possibly dismantled and its stones carried across the country to be reassembled at Stonehenge. Meaning the monument may not simply be built from ancient stone, but from an even older monument carried a great distance and given a second life. Somewhere in Wales, there may be an empty circle in the grass, still shaped like the space its stones used to fill. The symbols on a small clay disc no one has matched. On the island of Crete in 1908, archaeologists uncovered a small, fired clay disc. Just over 6 inches across, covered on both sides with a spiral of stamped symbols, pictures of people, animals, plants, and tools arranged in neat sections. The Phaistos disc, as it's known, is unlike almost anything else found from the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Its symbols weren't carved by hand, the way most inscriptions from this era were, but stamped into the wet clay using individual seals, a printing-like technique that implies the symbols themselves may have been used repeatedly elsewhere. And yet no other object using the same symbol set has ever been found. That total isolation is what makes it so hard to decode. Every other ancient script we've eventually read was cracked with the help of related inscriptions, bilingual texts, or repeated symbols found across many objects. This disc stands almost completely alone, a message with no other letters anywhere in the world to compare it to. More than a century of proposed solutions, religious hymn, board game, calendar, contract, curse have come and gone, none proven, none disproven. A single small circle of clay, spinning its message inward, toward a center it never quite reaches, and neither yet have we. The script carved into wood that only a few could ever read. On Easter Island, alongside the famous stone giants, the islanders once used a writing system carved into wooden tablets called Rongorongo. rows of small glyphs depicting figures, animals, and plants, arranged in a unique reading pattern where each line alternates direction, top to bottom. By the time European missionaries arrived in the 1860s and began asking about the tablets, the number of islanders who could still read them had already been drastically reduced, largely due to disease and the devastating effects of external slave raids in the preceding years. Within a generation, the knowledge of how to read Rongorongo was effectively gone. A small number of wooden tablets survive in museums today, their carved lines, patient and precise, clearly meaningful to the people who made them, and largely unreadable to us now, a writing system that outlived, by only the narrowest of margins, everyone who understood it. It's a quiet reminder of how fragile knowledge really is, not lost to time so much as lost to silence, a script that simply ran out of readers before it ran out of listeners. The city of stone built across a lagoon. Off the coast of the Micronesian island of Pohnpei, there's a set of nearly 100 small artificial islets, built from massive interlocking basalt columns, some naturally hexagonal, stacked log cabin style, into walls up to 25 feet high, laced together by a network of tidal canals. This is Madol, sometimes called the Venice of the Pacific, though it predates that comparison by many centuries. Construction is believed to have taken place gradually from around 1200 CE onward, using columns quarried from a volcanic source elsewhere on the island and somehow transported without cranes or wheeled vehicles across the water to be assembled into a small stone city built directly on a coral reef. Local oral tradition attributes the city's construction to twin sorcerer brothers who use levitation to move the giant stones into place. A legend historians read not as literal fact, but as a story that grew generation by generation to explain a feat of engineering otherwise hard to account for by ordinary means. Today, the site sits mostly abandoned, mangroves growing up through courtyards, water lapping gently at walls that have held their shape for the better part of 1,000 years, waiting in the quiet the way most old things eventually do. The pyramid with no name for its builders. Northeast of modern Mexico City, in the ruins of the ancient city of Teotihuacan, stands the Pyramid of the Sun, one of the largest pyramids ever built in the pre-Columbian Americas, and a city that was, at its peak, around 500 CE, among the largest in the world. And yet we don't know with real confidence what its builders called themselves, or even what language they originally spoke. By the time the Aztecs encountered the ruins, centuries later, the city had already been abandoned for hundreds of years, and it was the Aztecs who gave it the name we still use, Teotihuacan, meaning roughly the place where the gods were created, a name given by people who arrived long after the builders were already gone. Inheriting a city with no one left to explain it. Beneath the pyramids, tunnels have been found filled with thousands of carefully arranged objects, pottery, jade, and reflective pyrite mirrors laid out like a small constellation on the tunnel floor, seemingly recreating the layout of the night sky underground for reasons still argued over. An entire civilization, its language guessed at, its name borrowed from strangers, its buried stars still quietly pointing towards something we haven't fully translated. The bronze faces buried all at once. In 1986, farmers in China's Sichuan province, digging an irrigation ditch, uncovered two large pits filled with an extraordinary collection of bronze and jade objects, including bronze masks and heads with strikingly exaggerated features, enormous protruding eyes, some on stalks extending several inches from the face, and ears shaped like wings. This was the ancient Sanxingdui culture, a Bronze Age civilization that appears to have thrived along the Yangtze River more than 3,000 years ago. Entirely unmentioned in the earliest layers of traditional Chinese historical texts, a major sophisticated culture. That history, until 1986, had simply never recorded. The objects in the pits appear to have been deliberately broken, burned, and buried together, all at once, in what looks like a single, coordinated ritual event, rather than a gradual accumulation. As if an entire civilization's most sacred objects were retired together on one particular day for a reason that still isn't fully understood. Faces with eyes that seem to reach outward, buried together in the dark, waiting more than 3,000 years for a farmer's shovel to finally let them look at daylight again. The warriors whose weapons never rusted. Near the city of Xi'an in China, an army of more than 8,000 life-sized terracotta soldiers stands in careful formation. Buried alongside China's first emperor to guard him in the afterlife. Each face reportedly unique, down to individual expressions and hairstyles. Among the thousands of bronze weapons found buried with them, swords, spears, arrowheads, many were pulled from the ground, still sharp and still gleaming after more than 2,000 years underground. Largely free of the corrosion that should have long since dulled and pitted them. For years, researchers debated why. One theory, later questioned by further chemical analysis, suggested the bronze had been deliberately treated with a thin chromium coating. An anti-rust technique, otherwise not documented, is a historical record until the 20th century. More recent research points instead toward the composition of the bronze alloy itself and the unusually dry, low-oxygen conditions of the burial pits, working together to preserve the metal, a more grounded explanation, though no less remarkable for it. An emperor's silent army, standing in formation in the dark for 2,000 years, weapons still faintly catching the light the moment they're finally uncovered. The great stone city, no one expected to find there. In the hills of southern Africa, in what's now Zimbabwe, the stone ruins of Great Zimbabwe rise in curved granite walls up to 32 feet high, built entirely without mortar. The stones cut and fitted with such care that the structure has stood for roughly 7 centuries. When European explorers first encountered the ruins in the 19th century, many refused to believe local African builders were capable of the achievement and spent decades promoting alternative theories. Phoenician traders, biblical figures, lost civilizations from elsewhere entirely, rather than accept the more straightforward and correct answer. Modern archaeology has firmly established that Great Zimbabwe was built and inhabited by the ancestors of the Shona people, a thriving trade capital at the center of a network reaching as far as the Indian Ocean coast. Evidenced by imported glass beads and Chinese porcelain found among the ruins. The mystery today isn't who built it, it's why, at its height, a city of perhaps 10 to 20,000 people was gradually abandoned by the 15th century, likely a slow combination of exhausted resources, shifting trade routes, and a changing climate. Rather than any single dramatic collapse, stone walls, curved and patient, still standing, long after the reasons for leaving them quietly stopped needing to be spoken aloud. The steps where a whisper turns into thunder. At the base of El Castillo, the great stepped pyramid at Chichen Itza in Mexico, there's an acoustic effect that still surprises visitors today. Stand at the base of the staircase and clap your hands once, sharply, and the echo that bounces back off the pyramid's stepped sides doesn't sound like an ordinary echo. It sounds, to many ears, remarkably like the chirp of the quetzal, a brightly colored bird considered sacred by the Maya. Acousticians who've studied the effect believe it comes from the precise, evenly spaced geometry of the pyramid's staircase steps, which scatter the reflected sound in a way that happens to closely mimic the frequency pattern of the bird's actual call. Whether by careful design or by a kind of beautiful coincidence baked into the math of the structure, researchers still don't fully agree. At the top of the same pyramid, on the spring and autumn equinox, the setting sun casts a shadow along the staircase's edge that appears to form the body of a serpent, slithering down to meet a carved stone serpent head at the base. Light and sound, both quietly rehearsed by the same building, for an audience that hasn't stood there in centuries, and yet the pyramid still performs the trick each year, whether or not anyone comes to watch. That's where we'll leave it tonight. Machines from the sea. Cities built before farming existed. A battery no one asked for. Lines meant for the sky. A language never spoken aloud again. Caves no one wrote down. Stones that fit like breath. Concrete that heals. Giants who walked and then rested. A script we can see but not hear. A map holding a memory older than its maker. A library that quietly, slowly let itself go. A carving mistaken for a light bulb. Stones carried across a country. A disc no one could ever match. A writing system that outlived its last reader by only a few short years. A city built on water. A pyramid whose builders left before anyone learned their name. Bronze faces buried together all at once, weapons that refuse to rust. A stone city underestimated for all the wrong reasons, and a staircase that still quietly performs its trick each equinox, for no one in particular. None of it needs solving tonight. It never did. If your eyes are already closed, that's exactly where they should be. And if they're still open, just a little, there's another quiet mystery waiting right after this one, whenever you're ready. No rush, no sound, just drifting gently into whatever comes next.